So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Tuesday Times Roundtable, where each week we engage in conversations and discourse around current global issues, trends, problems, and opportunities that are of interest to you, our FIU community. And this week we welcome some students from outside FIU, from the University of Miami School of Law. If you're here from Professor Prado's class, hello, welcome. So our weekly Tuesday Times Roundtable is made possible through a formal partnership through the New York Times. If you're with us in person today, you can pick up one of these cards that has the URL for signing up. But this partnership brings a New York Times guest speaker once a year to come and talk to us. We had a phenomenal presentation on global warming earlier this year in the spring. And it also gives free digital access to the newspaper to all FIU students, faculty, and staff that I find super valuable. I believe the link should be right there. So I'm Anna Prado, the graduate assistant in the Office of Global Learning Initiatives, and yes, I am not your regular host. You are not mistaken. I'm not Sherry. But with us today are my colleague Sherry Beeson, who is your regular host and the Senior Program Coordinator of the Office of Global Learning Initiatives. And in the tiny box on the screen, we didn't actually place her in the box. She's just joining us via Zoom, is Michelle Zaldivar, the Program Coordinator with the most technical know-how. And without whom we would probably be here making finger puppets and drawing on the walls with our crayons. So we are very glad that you are here, whether you're here live and in person, whether you're meeting us via Zoom, or whether you're watching us recorded at another time after we've already left the building. So stick around after Professor Prado's discussion for some important announcements regarding all things global, like points and upcoming activities, including the Global Learning Medallion Program. Later during our session, we're going to take your questions. If you're joining us virtually, post your questions in the chat, and Michelle will share your questions with us. Hopefully, we'll have time to address all of those today. Otherwise, we'll be walking around with the mic later to make sure that your questions are answered. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's guest, Antonio Prado, who also happens to be my dad. So Antonio Prado's professional experience includes over 30 years. Oh, I have to turn it on. Sorry. Antonio Prado's professional experience includes over 30 years as the president and CEO of the Hamilton Group. He's a South Florida developer of commercial projects and residential communities. He's also the executive director of CED, Collective Empowerment Group, and an adjunct faculty member of the developer in residence of the University of Miami School of Law. So with 30 years of professional experience as a builder and developer, his past business experience also includes serving as a director of the Pacific National Bank in Miami since its founding in 1985 until he retired in 2009. But retirement for Dad is about doing more things and joining more organizations and doing more good work in the community. So that's probably what your retirement will look like for many of you who are Global Learning Medallions. Since 2013, Mr. Prado has served as pro bono executive director of the CEG Collective, the Empowerment Group of South Florida. It's a consortium of more than 40 predominantly African-American churches engaged in development of primarily for sale affordable housing, which is why he's going to come and talk to us today. So his current activities include outsourced financial and real estate development consulting to private sector businesses through Hamilton Planning Consulting, providing financial feasibility studies, the oversight of project financing, and the supervision of development operations and timelines, and coordination with in-house management and the outside professional team. Professor Prado has a long history of community service, which includes more than 30 years of experience as a volunteer and board member of numerous nonprofit organizations, including the Neighborhood Housing Services of South Florida, Americans for Immigrant Justice, who we'll hear from later on this semester, formerly FIAC, the Habitat for Humanity of Greater Miami, the East Little Havana Community Development Organization?
Community Development Corporation.
And Cairo's Prison Ministry. So it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Prado here to FIU. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thanks for all of you that are here in person and to those of you that are joining us virtually. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to talk about this subject that every day that goes by, something shows up on the news media about it as the crisis of affordable housing gets worse and worse everywhere. What gets this my presentation here started is this New York Times article of a month ago, which they're talking about the huge problems that the mayoral candidates in New York City are facing before the Democratic primary. And if you read that article carefully, you can see the writing on the wall. That is the direction that Miami is going, and pretty soon all the problems that you are seeing in that you read in that article about New York City are going to be visiting us here, unless we do something about it. I must tell you that Anna, of course, my daughter is proud of my credentials, but I must tell you one thing. I've been doing this work now for 9 years, this pro bono job with this Association of Black Churches. When I started, after having developed and built probably 600 homes in Miami, I thought that this would be a slam dunk. This would be an easy job for me. So in this past 9 years, I've had to eat a substantial amount of humble pie, as I've had to throw away most of what I knew and I had to start again, learning how to do this with very little in the way of resources, working with populations of people that have been unfairly left behind, that have low income, that have lower levels of education, just to try to do it in a way that I'm sensitive to what their needs are. That in itself has been an education for me. And the most significant thing is that particularly the past 2 or 3 years, I find myself increasingly being referred to as an expert in affordable housing. And the reality of it is not so much that I know so much, but that so few people know anything about affordable housing that easily positions me as an expert, because so few people know about anything that deals with it. When you hear about affordable housing anywhere, at least in Florida, but especially Miami, you're talking about generally, with only one exception that I'll mention, about rental apartments. The reason for that is that there's only a huge tax incentive in the Internal Revenue Code for production of rental apartments. And there's none for production of for sale units. This is why everything that is done in the affordable housing niche is concentrated in the hands of probably 7 or 8 statewide large builders developers, all except one. They're all for profit. And it's a very, very profitable niche. And those tax credit developers do nothing except tax credit apartments because it's so profitable, and they haven't found a way to make a lot of money just doing anything else than that. The exception to that is Habitat for Humanity, on whose board I served for probably 15 years in 3 different time periods. Habitat is a great organization. They have a great product, but their business model is such that they take no money from the government. They finance the huge subsidies that each house that they build needs by private donations. So what the result of that is that they're stuck building about 40 homes a year. Now, 40 homes a year for 30 years is a lot of homes, but 40 homes a year nowadays in Miami, unfortunately, is a drop in the bucket, and they haven't found a way to expand their capacity. So in fact, they're running out of single-family lots, and we'll get more into the nuances of what type of units constitute affordable housing. Their latest project, as they ran out of single-family home lots, they started a large project in South Dade, way down in South Dade, probably about US 1 and 260, for 280 townhouse units. So for what they've never wanted to do, they always wanted to do detached single-family homes. The realities of the marketplace are now taking them into doing townhouses, which I guess they swore that they would never do. Well, that's how reality will do to you. In that context, you'll understand why the focus of our small nonprofit, and when I say small nonprofit, and you'll hear all the things that we're doing now with such a small budget, I dare say that there's no one involved in the business that we are in right now that is smaller than us. It's almost mathematically impossible to be smaller as an organization than we are, and yet we're doing a number of things. We bought a few years back 26 infill lots from Miami-Dade County. We don't have the capacity to build them ourselves, so we teamed up with a number of local developers to give an opportunity to smaller players to come into the picture and gain experience. We're happy to say that 2 of those partners that we have are African-American builders that probably would not have had a chance before without this opportunity. So with those 4 partners, we're permitting our 19 scatter lots. Of the 26, 19 are scattered throughout the Liberty City and Brownsville. We already have 4 single-family homes under production. Pretty soon, we will have 2 duplex models under production as well in the next few weeks. And on 7 of the lots that are together, we're planning a 16-unit project of smaller units, like townhouse-type units, 16 what we call flex units in 4-unit buildings, but all for sale. We at the CEG, we are determined as much as we can, and to try to engage others and energize others to do the same, to produce homeownership units, because we are convinced that unless we find a way to produce homeownership units for lower-income families, those families will be condemned to be renters forever, and they will never be financially independent. The only possibility that we see for lower-income families to acquire some family wealth and long-term, and in the long term, it'll take a while, as equity in their homes appreciates, to obtain long-term financial independence is going to be from ownership. But as you will see, there are many obstacles. This is why there are so few players and everybody's scratching their heads, because the social and economic consequences of just putting lower income people always in rental units will have consequences in the future. So we're trying to do something about it. We're trying to do some new ideas, and there's plenty of things that we're trying to experiment with and try to break the mold and challenge some of the bigger players to see if we can find a way to make this niche affordable. As you can imagine, I've been doing this now for quite a while, so I've got copious notes on the subject of affordable housing. But of all the notes that I have collected, my daughter Anna picked, brilliant that she is, she picked the toughest question of everything that she could pick among all the notes that I have. The question is, should affordable housing be a social right? This is a question that normally, and we Americans are very practical people, we're not much given to philosophical issues. We want to see the bottom line, we want to see the practical solutions. But the question of whether affordable housing should be a social right, something that everybody living in this free and prosperous community should be entitled to, is a question that we normally don't like to ask. I'm not so sure that people are very comfortable asking that kind of question. So we'll get more into that. Before we get into the big question, which is really what brought us here to this headline in this talk, and I think it's the more fascinating question because it will have the most consequences for your new generation for the future. Let's go back to the practical issues that everybody's more comfortable with. Obstacles, problems, and possible solutions to the affordable housing crisis. The principal reality that we're dealing with, and it's a reality that some people are sort of in denial for a number of reasons people just don't want to face, is that rising land values everywhere, even in the faraway suburbs of Miami, but particularly in the close-in locations, rising land values and increases in construction costs. In the past 2 years, construction costs in Miami have probably gone up 20%. And yet we are operating in an economy, on the macroeconomy, there's virtually no inflation, they say. Yet in the construction industry, at least 20% prices have gone up in 2 years. So you can imagine that affordable housing gets hit more by that, because if you're building luxury apartments in Coral Gables and your costs go up, you pass on the cost, the increased cost to the cost of your product, like any other product or service in the marketplace. Only when we're dealing with affordable housing, we're locked in, because the buying power and the rental ability of the consumers of the product or the service are just limited. So the inevitable consequences that we will see, and you will see, you can say that you heard it here at FIU first. The inevitable consequence of this reality is that solutions in the future will have to be leaning toward a combination of higher densities Higher densities mean that we're going to all have to be living closer together. We'll get more into that of the social and political consequences of having to live closer together. So we will going to have to find solutions by way of higher densities. The idea of that habitat single-family home, which is a Cadillac, a subsidized Cadillac, will be eventually disappearing. And smaller units. That's the other second half of the reality. People are just going to have to get used to living in smaller units. By smaller units, I mean the idea of the traditional 3-bedroom, 2-bath, single-family home. Pretty soon it's going to be only available to very wealthy people, and the average people are going to have to live in smaller units. We are already experimenting, as I told you, with building duplex homes on a single-family lot, getting 2 units instead of 1, 4-plex buildings. Eventually, if we can, and this is we go with the direction of the market, we will hope to be producing even smaller units, what is called missing middle housing units, smaller townhouses, smaller condos, micro units, condominium micro units. There are already large buildings in Overtown being permitted with 400 square feet apartments. 400 square feet apartment is something that no one had seen in Miami before. If you own a 400 square foot apartment in downtown, in midtown Manhattan, you're a millionaire. And so people are very happy to have a 400 square foot apartment in a condo in Manhattan. Not in Miami yet, but it's coming. And something that you will understand that is probably the most radical thing, you probably heard of WeWork, of shared office spaces. Well, I guarantee you that there's already in Wynwood, one large developer, this already I think it's already under construction, a large project in which they're going to have co-living units. Co-living units is like a dorm, like a college dorm. You have privacy in your bedroom, but the common areas are shared. And I'd say to you that eventually we will even see condominium co-living units. That sounds radical, that sounds heretical, but it's coming. The reality is the marketplace will just force you to do it. And as I tell a lot of people that it's hard to visualize a 400 square foot apartment. People think that they cannot do it because we've never done it. Think about this, which I tell people so that you can visualize something that you can relate to. The average size in a mass market cruise line, think about a Carnival cruise line, the average size of a cabin is 165 square feet. And many of you have spent a week there. And it's true that you were on vacation, but you can live on 165 square feet. So certainly we can live in a 400 square foot apartment. It's just that the consumers at all price points, whether you are wealthy or you're a low-income people, you will be surprised how low-income people are fighting and screaming because they want that habitat Cadillac. They want the big house. Well, you ain't going to get it because it's simply not going to be possible. So consumers that want bigger lots, bigger houses, are going to have to get, you remember, well, most of you weren't even born with the first oil crisis, when we have to get into compacts because everybody had to give up the big cars. Look now at the cars. We are very wasteful. We're used to everybody. There's how many F-150s you see driving around here on Southwest A Street? I dare say to you that 80% of the people that drive a F-150 have never put anything on the back of the truck. It's just probably a macho thing just to drive a F-150. But we're used to having these big trucks, and we're used to having big dwelling units. The big dwelling units are fast disappearing, and that's what you're going to see in the future in the affordable housing business and in all producers, because even the luxury producers are facing the same pressures of land and increases in construction. Now, the big picture, large-scale solutions that we will be seeing here in the Miami area are not likely to come primarily from the government. If you read carefully the article of the New York Times about the housing crisis in New York City, you will see that just about all the mayoral candidates are recommending different variations of throwing tons of dollars by the government to the problem. And yet the affordable housing crisis in New York keeps on getting worse, and yet they do have tons of dollars, more than we have in Miami. The reality that it's not going to be an efficient solution because generally the government is not very efficient about what they do. It's a shame, and I wish, and I'm not an anti-government guy in the country, we'll talk more about that, but the reality is that the government is not going to be the best provider of the solutions to the affordable housing crisis. We rely on it too much, and we are expecting things that may not happen so easily. We would like to think ourselves that we live all our daily lives around under an egalitarian democratic order. That is some of the illusions that we like to live in. The reality is that there's no such thing. Everything that each one of you finds and deals with in your everyday life is not order along a democratic order, but an aristocratic order. We don't like that word here too much in the United States, but it's an aristocratic order. It's the aristocracy of talent, of experience, of track record, of proven credentials, whether you're a ship captain in a cruise liner or whether you're a surgeon at University of Miami or FIU College of Medicine, or whether you're just in charge of the janitorial service here. You only get that job based on credentials, experience, track record. There are only two exceptions to that rule. Only two exceptions that I know of. The problem is that the two exceptions carry very significant consequences. The two exceptions are making babies and running for public office. Except for those two activities, you need talent, you need to be, those are the only two that run based on popularity. Now, making babies, that's not something I'm going to go into. That's a little bit above my pay grade. So I'm going to stick with the government solutions and the government attempts to try to regulate the problem. The solution to the problem will have to be, and we will have to find new ways of doing it, increasing the supply of affordable units. You see, General Motors produces both Cadillacs and compacts. They found a way to make money on the compact and make less money. Nobody forces them. There's no mandate to produce so many compact cars for every so many Cadillacs you produce. They found a way to make money on different product lines. In the affordable housing business, there's unfortunately too much of a tendency to think that the government is going to regulate us into the solutions and is going to force us into the producers that are making money doing something because that's why they would do it, to asking them to do things that somehow they are going to impact the bottom line. If you think, for example, that rent controls, well, you see the article here of the New York Times, in New York City, the supply of rent subsidized, they call them rent subsidized apartments, is huge. You would think that puts a big dent in the crisis, and yet the crisis keeps on getting worse. Most methods of regulating the supply and trying to control the problem tend to make production smaller, because the people that have to produce, unless you make a reasonable profit like in any other service, you're not going to sell a hamburger if you're going to lose money selling the hamburger. You have to make a reasonable profit in whatever product or service you produce. So eventually, rent controls just about everywhere in the world. They start with political pressure, sometimes with good intentions. The record is that the results are generally terrible. Since I am an old-timer, I clip things. I have a newspaper, actual print clippings of things that I clip. Then I will keep on my computer, but I first read them on newspapers or magazines. If you're interested, I can send you copies of articles that I have on the results of rent controls. I can remember South Korea, Berlin, and the most recent one, Sweden, which is probably the most socialized economy in Europe. And in Sweden, they have rent controls for every single rental apartment. Gradually, they work themselves, that must have started with some, eventually they work themselves into having rent controls in every single rental apartment in Sweden. The last article that I read in The Economist, the crisis of affordable housing is so serious that now they don't know how to back themselves out of that problem, because politically it's very difficult to reverse those kind of populist policies. So I guarantee you, We are going to, if the pressures here of Miami keep on getting worse, you're going to see in the paper people talking about rent controls. Don't fall for that, because unfortunately, sometimes, even if you do it for the best intentions to try to alleviate the crisis, in the end, it produces the opposite effect. The solution has to be finding ways of making production of affordable housing units profitable. And if it has to be smaller, if the government should subsidize, provide incentives, and this is really probably the best thing that the government could do and the public sector could do, is to find ways of providing incentives so that the builders build more units that are affordable. Incentives, for example, reducing permit fees. If you build smaller units, instead of building Cadillacs, if you build compacts, if you build smaller units and you can provide incentives to the builder of those units for the units to be more profitable, then they will have an incentive of producing more affordable units. I guarantee you this is really how it's going to go. So enough of a detour on practical issues. Let's go back to the question that showcases the talk. Should affordable housing be a social right? Think about this, because most people probably haven't thought about this before, and this is what I find when I see those stairs. What do you mean a social right? Public education here in this country, and this is the founding fathers came up with this idea. It was very important to them. Public education through high school is an entitlement. It's a social right. I have a libertarian friend in my book discussion group that is an extreme libertarian that believes that the government has absolutely no duties, not even public education, except public safety, protection of property and person. But that is very few people believe that. Generally, very few people would say that free high school education through public schools is something that we owe to everybody that is part of this community. So I ask you, why through public high school? Why not less? Why not stop at middle school? Why not more? You have seen in the recent campaigns that some candidates have been talking about providing free college tuition at some point, at some level. So it doesn't, where the line is now drawn doesn't mean that it has to stay there. But if we ask that question, then we can ask some companion questions. Why not some minimum social right to health care? If you have any familiarity with the examples of Great Britain and Canada, in Great Britain and Canada, everyone complains about how it's not perfect. But try to get anybody to change it. It's there, and both in Canada and Great Britain. In Britain, the National Health Service, and in Canada, their socialized medicine is as sacred a cow as Social Security is in this country. And they're proud of it. They're extremely proud of it, because at least there's a basic safety net for everyone. You may have to wait for elective surgery. You may not have all the choices that we have here, that if you get sick, you have 17 MRI machines available to you. Of course, that comes at a cost. So this is why one of the reasons that we have not been able to figure out a way to provide a basic minimum in health care. The same could be said on affordable housing. I don't pretend to tell you what the solution is going to be. What is the minimum? What should everyone get? Should it be only for rentals? Should it be also for homeownership units? A lot of people are trying to experiment with this, because there's a sense that at some point in time, in this free and prosperous community that we live in, that there ought to be some responsibility to everyone to provide some basic minimum on some basic things that everyone needs as a matter of your basic human rights. We're not there yet. Some places are talking about a guaranteed minimum income. In places like the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, they have so much money and such a small population that they've been doing that for a long time, so nobody questions that. If we have plenty of money, then nobody would complain giving a certain minimum of money to everyone. Oh, some people complain that if you do that, some people are going to be lazy. Look at what's happened now with COVID. Yeah, some people, when they get the unemployment benefits, don't want to work. But pretty soon, you can find ways of working around these things. None of these things lend themselves to easy solutions, but the point, and you are in a university setting, that your generation ought to be asking these questions. What should be a right? Where should the rights stop? But I must also warn you that once you start getting down that road, you ought to also ask the question, what duties do we have? Do we have any duties that go along with the rights? If we have a Bill of Rights, one of the most cherished traditions that we have in this nation. How come we don't have a Bill of Duties? Is it only rights? We don't have obligations that go with the rights that we claim? Once you start going down that road, you're going to have to ask that hard question. Our nonprofit organization, small though it is, published last year what we call a civic platform, what we call a Prosperity for All platform. It's probably Miami's best kept secret, except because we're so small that nobody knows we're here. If Warren Buffett, I think the most revolutionary idea of the last 20 years is Warren Buffett's idea of the Giving Pledge, where he challenged billionaires, and so many people have followed him, to donate when they die half of their wealth to charity, to foundations. Now, if the Warren Buffett guy came up with the platform for all, Prosperity for All platform, it would be famous. But since this was my idea so far, it's been consigned to a closet, but I think some of these ideas have merit. The highlight of this platform, and 2 years ago, because I've been rehashing this for a while, a young law student heard this, I said this in class, and she said, can I write a paper in the law review about it? Only this part of it, because the platform includes several ideas. And this is a 1% tax on luxury homes valued in excess of $1 million. And this would apply to every home, not like in Vancouver, where it's easier to just tag it on foreigners. In Vancouver, they have a luxury tax on luxury homes, but only for foreigners. That some people have been talking about here in Miami because there's so many foreigners that own property. But I think it's more fair and square to have it. If we're going to have it, let's have it for everybody that has a home of more valued at more than $1 million. And in our idea, the rate escalates as the value of the home keeps on going higher. As I looked at my notes, and I got plenty of notes on all of these stuff, I realized that in 2014, I wrote an essay, just about a year after I started working at the CEG. I wrote an essay on the subject of moral obesity. I have the essay, if you're interested, is only one page, and it has a more highfalutin title. The complete title of the essay is Moral Obesity and the Coming Transformation of Capitalism, as foreshadowed by the history of the fork. If you're interested, it's only one page. I'll send it to you. But the interesting thing is the subject of moral obesity, because this is another subject that we don't like to talk too much. So I'll ask you this. If someone in Miami, and right now if you read the business papers, this rare as a day goes by that there's not an article with admiration, a glowing article, because so-and-so just bought a $30 million house or a $30 million apartment. So I say to you, does someone that lives in a city where so many people have a house in crisis, does someone that lives in a $30 million home, could that be considered a symptom, at least a symptom of moral obesity? Well, that's not a question that a lot of people like to ask in such a prosperous community. I'm not a man of the left. I'm a capitalist, try and. So some people might say, well, you're a loser. You say that because you can't afford a $30 million home. And so I will say that I don't consider that anybody that has something that seems to have more than they need is necessarily a symptom of moral obesity. But this I would say to you, if you live in a $30 million home, you have 30 times the moral obligation that someone that lives in a $1 million home. The moral obligation to do something for the community, to give something back. Some way to get something back, almost like paying a little extra rent for living in a place that is so free and so prosperous. And especially if you can, and if you're so inclined, particularly for large parts of the population that have been subject to inequity and exclusion, have been unfairly left behind. So how about that? If you have a $30 million home and you live up to that standard, all that I would wish for you is that next year you trade it up for a $50 million home. And next year you do 50 times more for the community. Will we be willing to hold people to that standard? I guarantee you not yet today, but that's food for thought for you, for the new generation. Another another item there in our Prosperity for All platform is something that many of you would probably like and relate to more easily. This one of the other items that we propose there in the platform is a partial mitigation of student debt. But in return for that, we would ask that those who receive that benefit would commit to a 12 months community service, sort of like a Miami Peace Corps. You get something, you have to give something back. We believe at the CEG in what we call reciprocal giving. You get some benefit that normally you would not get. Then now see how do you give something back in return for that? Now, if you look at the entire platform, if you're interested, it's a 2-page essay. I'm kind of long-winded, but we try to keep these things as to the attention span of most people today. It's only a 2-page platform that sort of spells out the different things. But if you look closely at it, and this you'll see now will make sense when you remember the things that I said earlier, what is radical about all of our proposals in our civic platform is that they are all focused on getting new sources of revenue to address the problems that we have in the community. But all of those new revenues will be placed in an independent civic authority, independent of political pressure, elected officials, government staffers. I believe that properly placed, properly focused, and properly explained, a lot of people that have a lot of money that would say, no way I'm going to give one more penny to taxes, might be willing to part with their money. But people that earn their money the hard way are not going to part with that money unless we can be sure that that money doesn't go back to the usual suspects that have gotten us to this point of crisis. If we do that, this is why people just say there's no way to pass a new tax, no way to pass a new bond issue, because just people are tired. So I think there are ways of addressing these problems, but people just have to, we have to make something that makes sense, that is politically very difficult to bring about, but that is what we have to be facing in order to be realistic and be able to find solutions that will work. Now, in closing, is this university the proper forum for raising these questions that normally, you see how far we've traveled from the practical issues that you read in the paper about problems, obstacles, solutions. This kind of philosophical issues are not the kind of things that we like normally in everyday life, but this is the proper venue. The university is where these questions ought to be asked, and these questions of social rights, social duties, values, moral obligations, this is the proper venue for asking those kind of questions. And your generation has absolutely a right to ask those questions and to challenge us. I am a funny kind of conservative. I think that every new generation has a duty to challenge conventional wisdom, tradition, and everything that you're getting back from us, and just challenge it and expose it in the open air and see if it's really legitimately worth preserving. And keep the things that are worth preserving, but the ones that are not, just throw it out the door. So these are the kind of questions that your generation ought to be asking. This is the proper venue for it. I'm not so sure. I had this conversation at UM where I helped teach a class for students that are master's degree candidates in probably a very expensive course. They're paying a lot of dollars for it. And I said to my friend, the associate dean of the law school, which is the one that recruited me into doing that I said that our courses are great and the students are getting extraordinary value, but it's all about tradecraft. It's about learning a trade so you can learn a lot of money by what the fees that you're paying. Do we not have some sort of responsibility to then also be talking about civics and ethics and values and principles? Are students willing to part with a lot of money for that kind of course? I'm not so sure, but I would tell you. The classical Greeks, I'm a reader of many things, the classical Greeks had a word for the purpose of education. It's a sort of a tongue twister, hard to spell. Peida. P-A-I-D-E-I-A, Paida. It's just a single word. That's sort of translated into what it means is the shaping of character. The purpose of education was the shaping of character, and it was a lifelong journey. Shaping of your character would go on until your last days. It would not end when you get a graduation here. Are you going to solve all the problems of affordable housing in Miami? Or even if you ask the broader questions, are you going to solve all the problems in the world? Well, not likely. But you will do well to be faithful. I'll leave you with this last thought. With the wisdom of two Hebrew words that come to us through the courtesy of the tradition of the Jewish people. Tikkun olam. Tikkun olam. To repair the world. Quite a worthwhile project for you as you go on your lifelong journey. So thanks very much for being here. Here we have some questions. We can get questions. I don't know if we have time. Questions from the audience. Questions or I don't know how that works. I'm extremely low tech, so you got to be patient with me.
Okay, yes, it's on. So I do have a bunch of questions, but I'll just ask one. So I have seen things about like 3D printed homes and how they can be made like really quickly, like within a day, and it's just like a machine that's kind of laying out the home. So I wanted to know if you heard about that or what your thoughts are.
That is the newest thing, and a lot of people are experimenting with modular homes, with prefab homes. That maybe there will be some experimentation. So for container homes, we've talked to someone in Pembroke Pines for one of our churches he has all sorts of ideas about building with container homes. Some people have done it. So far, no one has been able to come up with a new building technology that significantly reduces the overall cost of the product at the end. Everybody has tried to do that, and this is why if you talk to old-timers here in Miami like myself, everybody raises their eyebrow because so many people have tried to do it so far it hasn't worked. 3D, I am not sure. That is really something like out of outer space. So I don't know if that will eventually be able to be a solution. That would be, of course, a solution if we can just sort of fax you home.
Right.
But I don't know yet. It's too new. I must tell you that it's still untested. That would be a great thing if it's possible.
And I do have one more question. So I know that this area is it's very pricey. So, and I know some areas that are, I guess, more or less desirable, they're more rural, they have cheaper homes. So would that be
what type of homes?
Just cheaper homes.
Oh, cheaper homes.
The cost of the homes are just not as high.
Well, but I will tell you, that's one of the problems with affordable housing. As you go further south in South Dade, and there are areas of South Dade that I'm very familiar with, a few people would know, the problem is that the only thing that will make the product lower is the lower cost of the land. But this is the problem with housing, is you put a house out there in Florida City, it costs you the same because there are no advances in building technology. It will cost you the same to build a house in Florida City as it would to build it in Coral Gables. The only difference is in Coral Gables, you put more flourishes, you put more lipstick on the pig, so to speak. That's what makes it more expensive. But the actual house itself, it'll cost you the same to build it in Florida City as it would anywhere else in town. So no one has been able to really bring down the cost. This is why I'm saying, and I'm an advocate, one way to do it until something else comes. Until a Deus Ex Machina comes in and gives us something that we hadn't thought of, one way of doing it is more density, smaller lots, and smaller units. Instead of living in a 1,500 square foot house, get used to living in a 1,000 square foot house. That is a real solution. But you'll be surprised how many people say, it's like the cars. I want a big car. I want an SUV. My wife drives an SUV because she's petite, and an SUV makes her feel big. So I'm not going to take her SUV away from her. Well, in housing, this is coming. We're just going to have to trade down in order to make it affordable.
Can I ask one more thing?
Sure.
So do these homes come equipped with like what kind of appliances? Like how modern is it, or how like desirable?
What, in the smaller homes?
Yeah, in these homes that are made.
No, the fact that a house is smaller doesn't mean that the appliances have to be different. In reality.
So are they small but still kind of, I guess, not necessarily luxury, but they're up to date and everything, and they're.
Yes, they do. But you are asking very good questions. This is another reality of building. That when you start building the homes, and I'm struggling now with all the new products that we're trying to design, the smaller homes, if you do a house, instead of 2,000 square feet, 1,000 square feet, you're not bringing the cost down 50%. Because the most expensive part of the house is the bathrooms and the kitchens. As long as you have 2 bathrooms and a kitchen, they keep on making them smaller because your generation doesn't cook much anyway. You microwave everything. So even today's kitchens are smaller, but still, the area that is cheaper to build in the house is the bedrooms, the living room. Those areas are on a per square foot basis. So when you shrink the house, you're bringing the cost down, but every little bit helps. I think it's better to do that. But it's a good question. It's not because you have the square footage, you don't have the cost. But it makes it more affordable for sure.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have questions online. I think there are actually 33 people who've joined us online today, if not more. So, Michelle, share some of those questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Thank you so much. You're getting. I'll share the chat with you, but you're getting all sorts of requests for the links to the articles that you've talked about. So if it's at all possible to get some of those today so we can share online, that would be great. If not,
which article?
So specifically the one that you mentioned that was moral obesity and the coming,
I brought a copy. If you can upload it, I brought a copy. You can upload it.
I can do that. And the proposal that you were talking about, the 2-page proposal.
I brought a copy as well, so you can upload both of those.
Beautiful. Just for everyone.
There's no copyright to them. One thing that we pride ourselves in this, I'm not generally fond of quoting Ronald Reagan, but of 2 quotes of Reagan that I love. One of them is, it is said, I don't know if it's an apocryphal story, that he kept it framed in the Oval Office. And they say that the quote said, "It's amazing how much you can get done where you don't care who gets the credit." So our ideas are not copyrighted. If you can steal our ideas and put it in practice and make things better, you are welcome to it. There are no royalties.
Beautiful. So we'll try to get that today to everyone. And if not, what we'll do is we'll definitely include links to all of those things on the YouTube when the video itself gets posted in about 2 weeks. So if you're curious to read about that and we have been able to get to it today, check out our YouTube channel then, and we'll have that linked. To some of the questions. So one of the first ones was about paying for some of these incentive programs, and you touched on that a little bit, especially with the 1% tax on the houses valued over $1 million. So they were just curious.
I didn't hear the first part of your question.
So specifically on the idea of paying for some of these incentives, right? And you talked briefly about a 1% tax on homes valued over $1 million.
Right.
So the curiosity was, in Miami, in our market, do we have data on how many homes that would be? Would that offset the cost? Like, what could we feasibly accomplish with those homes? Are there enough homes, I guess, is the vague way of phrasing that question, in Miami to be able to accomplish some of those goals?
That part of the problem will be very easy to fix because right now we have the technology. If you go to the Miami-Dade County Property Appraiser's website, every single property has like an ID, a folio number. Every single property has an estimated market valuation because nowadays the property appraiser has all these algorithms that I compare all the comparables. If you have any property that has a lot of comparable transactions, the estimated market value of the property appraisers is generally understood to be somewhere at 80 to 85% of real market value. So for us to do whether a house is worth $1 million, $2 million, it's a very simple mathematical computation. When I started in the business, it was guesswork. Nowadays, that's the easiest part of the work. Yes.
Amazing. And then the next question was about the actual construction of some of these homes and the best way to approach that, especially somewhere in South Florida where our construction codes are so strict because of, the general environment that we live in and the way that that's evolved, especially in the last 30 years post Andrew, right? So they were talking about metal homes, and someone earlier mentioned that 3D printed home and some of these more creative, out of the box, excuse the pun, ways of approaching building. How can we bring those two things together? What ways could we possibly act to make that work?
That's a great question. I already addressed the issue of the 3D printing is too new. Nobody really knows whether that's going to be real or not. Or you can do it in a mass production. Many of these 3D things that get manufactured, you don't do it in a large scale. And of course, we're talking about a large scale problem. As to new technology, I'm glad to say that one of our 4 builder developer partners for an Infolots is a team of 3 African-American gentlemen, very highly educated, competent people that were anxious to come to Miami and explore a new technology that they have. It's a new building system, and people that I've shown it to are very familiar with. I'm not a construction guy, so this is a little bit above my pay grade, but we already permitting their technology. It's a little bit more expensive than our other 3 partners on a per square foot basis, but they have some economies going to the future. Their homes are something called zero energy cost, that the cost of because of the energy efficiency, you would virtually be paying almost zero for electricity. Things that are, to me, like almost out of Star Wars, because again, I'm a numbers guy. I'm not a construction guy, but I'm very anxious to see the first home. The first will be a duplex home. They're very near getting a building permit, so I'll be very anxious to see how that plays out, because this is an opportunity to showcase something that is not normally seen in the marketplace. And they've used this technology for multifamily buildings or bigger buildings, but it's also hard generally to get people to buy an idea when it's just an idea. This is why we're very eager to have it built and show it, and then let people walk through it, and let's see if it works. So great.
Amazing. I don't want to dominate too. I want to give a chance, and I can't see everybody else that's in the room. So Sherry, let me know if you have a question that you want to get to in there. We'll tag.
Hi, how are you? So you talked about how these questions, we're supposed to be having them in universities, and I completely agree, but how do we take them outside of the university setting so that maybe some type of, probably very hard, but some type of action can be taken? You know, I love asking these questions. I probably ask myself philosophical questions constantly, but how do we start having these conversations outside of the university
That is
setting?
a great question, probably the best question we had so far, perhaps because it's a big picture question. I would tell you one thing. One of the advantages of being old, like I am, you can go back and look at 50 years ago, how were things different? I can tell you one thing that I remember very clearly. 50 years ago, and I came to this country a little bit more than that, even more than 50 years ago, you could think, and I could remember names of recognized voices of moral authority. 50 years ago, there were voices of theologians. How long has it been since you've heard the voice of a theologian talking about anything else? The anchors, there were only 3 network channels at that time. The anchor of the news anchor, Huntley, Ted Koppel, any of these anchors, what they gave you in this era of fake news, those were the facts. As Senator Moynihan famously said, you're entitled to your opinion, but not to your facts. 50 years ago, there was a general agreement what was the truth, what were facts and nobody would challenge, and then opinions. The paper had an editorial page. One of the things that we're facing too, and it's your generation to come up with us, we need new recognized voices of authority. That when they speak, people will say, it's funny because you asked this, because I was looking at something, and this is way beyond, even before my time. If you are familiar with American history, you remember one of the darkest pages of American history was in the 50s with the witch hunting of communists, the people that were accused of McCarthy times. The McCarthy era came to a stop, and I was just Googling this the other day by coincidence because I was thinking about this, exactly because for the same reason that you're asking me this, that the whole thing of McCarthy came to a boil and completely lost. When there's a guy by the name of Welch, who was an attorney for the Armed Services Committee, that asked Senator John McCarthy in a public hearing, when people already were fed up with this, he said, and I think something like the quote, you Google the quote, you just say these words and Google will pick up the quote. At long last, sir, have you no decency? This guy that challenged this, Joseph McCarthy, was the most dangerous man and most powerful man in America at that time, and this attorney challenged him in public. So there's some things in Miami, maybe your generation is going to have to say, when you see people being thrown out of their homes, people being evicted, people having to live homeless in the street, people not being able to work and to keep a job because of those conditions. Someone at some point in time is going to say to the people that have the movers and shakers, have you no decency? How can we put up with this? Right now, we don't have that. We had it for 50 years ago, and it made life in some ways simpler because there was that sense of there's some black and whites. Now everything seems to be grays. But it's a great question. That's your generation is going to have to see that, because with that kind of recognized voice, a lot of people are rudderless. Look at what's happening with the vaccine. Incredible. The thing with the vaccines, people don't believe in science. People don't believe in facts. We can't go on like this. I don't know how it's going to be solved, but I guarantee you this is no way to run a country.
Papi, do you want to show them the
Thank
slides
you.
about the project you're doing with your students? Because I think I have.
I'm sorry?
You want to show the project that you're doing with your students that you won with the YWCA? I think you have some slides on that, because I think that
No,
answers
that's
their
not it. The
questions.
YWCA side is not in here.
We do have two more questions from our
No. Let's see, we have
Zoom
more questions.
attendants. So, Michelle, back to you.
All right.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, this is the perfect transition, because the question in the chat was, to what extent do you think the issue of homelessness and affordable housing are interrelated?
Well, of
And
course,
how-
they're connected. Homelessness is the most extreme end of the problem of affordable housing, but people and the homeless situation is a little more complex. I remember many years ago, a business partner of mine ran the Chapman Partnership for the Homeless downtown, and I managed to get myself. I ran a book discussion group for the homeless for 6 months down there until they thought that I was crazy and they stopped sending me the people in there. And the problem with the homeless, I remember from reading at that time, is not just a housing problem. The problem of the homeless, which is really a tragic thing, is that the common denominator of the homeless, although the proximate cause seems to be some issues of drink or addictions of some time, the proximate, all experts at that time said, and this is a chilling recognition, a chilling fact, that ultimately the common denominator among the homeless people is a lack of affective connections, of the affective tissue that holds us together. That you could be homeless, and you have in European countries, they don't seem to have this. In Spain, at the time of the worst employment crisis, if you become homeless, someone will pick you up. A friend, a relative, someone will pick you up. But we will be thrown out as someone that you're valued so little that you can go almost unnoticed. Because worse than that is when a body appears up and is not claimed. That is probably the worst in the whole spectrum of what could happen. But homelessness is very close to that. So it's a very complex. Many of those, and remember in Miami we had the homeless population 20 years ago was around 8,000. Now it's down to 800. But those 800 refuse to be institutionalized. And I know what institutionalized means. I worked for 30 years as a prison volunteer. That's another expertise that I have of another world. And an institutionalized person just works in a different environment, gets used to a different type of life. And these 800 are just very hard to deal with, but we have to account for that. And I must tell you, because again, as I said, with the issue of rights and duties, we have to be fair also to the property owners. If you're a property owner, you don't want also a homeless person defecating in front of your business. That property owner also has some rights. So we have to find a way to balance, take care of our homeless population, produce enough housing units to put them in. But we have to also respect the rights of everybody else. Everybody has rights, and we cannot just give preference to someone and just afford and leave the other ones out. The problem with rights is that if you're going to hold to your moral high ground, you can make no exceptions. You have to be defending, you have to be protesting for abuses against blacks, but you also have to be protesting about abuses of Jews, by Muslims, American Indians. The moment that you make an exception to say this particular person doesn't deserve the same protection of rights, then you lose all claim to moral high ground. You just have to be, no one can be excluded. The rights have to be the same for everyone. And for homelessness, it's difficult. We just don't want to pay the cost of it. Like we don't want to pay the cost of other things. But it's really shameful that even in Miami, we could still have 800 people living under a bridge in those conditions of The lady, I remember the reason that I stopped my book discussion group at the homeless shelter there, because this is how you get jaded. I've seen this in the prison environment too. The lady that really got me there was the manager when I went there in the afternoons. One day, I used to come in there and sit in her office for a few minutes before going to the room where I would meet with the homeless people. And one day she said to me, you know, I don't understand how these people can live in this filth. After a while, this woman seeing that misery every day, she became jaded. I mean, it was hard for them to see these people, her clients, as human beings. It's hard to do. Not an easy thing to solve.
Thank you for that. And this next question was about an existing program that I think I'm going to read out, because it's hard for me to kind of sum it up. What about the old HUD housing developments where community had to provide 10% to HUD for low-income housing, and the property must stay within the program for 10 years before it can be sold for market sales? Are those kinds of programs still in place? And what do you think about the efforts to increase those kinds of programs or something similar?
Well, there are two things. One good, the other one not so good. The time during which some of those HUD finance projects are restricted as to affordability are not 10 years, but they're like 20, 30 years. But we're coming to a crisis because many of those HUD projects that were built in Miami 20, 30 years ago are coming to that point. And the developers of those projects that made a lot of money in the front end are now trying to see if they can turn those units into market units and now make another ton of money at the back end. And the government doesn't know how to deal with that because nobody saw that coming. So that's one. The other thing, there is a new thing by HUD. It's a federal HUD experimented with something called RAD. It's an acronym, R-A-D, is rental assistance something, whereby they have identified in many public housing projects in the nation that the project, and this happens in old buildings, are underbuilt, that the density of units that you have on that site is less than what the current zoning would accumulate. So under the new RAD program, and the county is very actively doing that, if you come to a place where you have 600 units and you have land to build a new 600 of new building, they will give you enough money to rehab the older units and use some part of the money to build a new one. So lo and behold, where you had 600, now you have 1,200. That's the newest thing that HUD is doing, and apparently works well. As you can imagine, I operate in a very small scale. That is a heart transplant business. I do microsurgery of a little joint with a little finger.
And we've got one more question in here.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Good afternoon. First, thank you for coming here and sharing your time with us. But more importantly, after learning a little about you, thank you for being who you are and your dedication to our community. I appreciate that sincerely. I wanted to get your thoughts. Generally, when we talk about affordable housing, we're talking about the underclass, the poor among us, those. But affordable housing is becoming a middle-class crisis in places like San Francisco, New York, even in some cases Miami, where the market is pricing people out at a much higher level. How does that change in terms of class impact, do you think, will impact potential solutions or changes in the market and in the thinking moving forward?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a loaded question in many ways. In our country, a lot of people say that we don't have class. In fact, for my book discussion group, I have a book selection for something that was a classic 30 years ago by Lewis Lapham, Money and Class in America. Because the only class that we have in America is money. We don't have, well, we have a big problem with racial issues, of course. But if you have a lot of money, and even if you're black, in reality, you're not on the underclass anywhere. So it's a matter of income. In the business of housing, for example, there's a term that you will see in the paper, affordable housing or workforce housing. It's a made-up term that generally, when you're talking about affordable housing, is housing that has some sort of government subsidy, and workforce housing is housing, as low as you can get it in pricing, that has no government subsidies, is conventionally financed with banks or elsewhere. So that is a distinction. It's an artificial distinction. But in reality, there is a continuum spectrum of pricing. And you will go in terms of buying or renting wherever you can, where there are the marketplace. Of course, the lower you go in the price range, the less available units are. One of the crises that we have is beyond a certain point, we're trying to build the houses that we're going to sell in Liberty City. We're going to sell a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house for $260,000. It sounds a lot, but the going rate is $350,000. We're probably going to be, and they're obviously not proud of the reason that nobody buys a house at $260,000 there. And you'll be surprised how many people, even Hispanic people, are coming into areas that are very, very black that 10 years ago nobody wanted to go because of the central location. But the problem is no supply. This is why I say the solution has to come in finding ways to producing more and producing more, not regulating the problem. If we try to regulate the problem just will get worse because the population keeps on going. Look at this crisis. Everybody wants to come to South Florida. Well, you can't reverse that. So we have to try better at being smarter about that. And of course, which is this one thing in which I've been remarkably unsuccessful for 9 years, is to challenging my peers, people that look like me, the movers and shakers, into sharing their shared responsibility. This is one of my story about moral obesity is very much appropriate right now. At some point in time, everybody has to take up their shared responsibility. Everybody has to pitch in. When we have a crisis, I remember if you were around Hurricane Andrew, you would see that for 2 weeks, people were just taking care of each other. Everybody was each other's keeper. That went away. We got to go back to that point because otherwise, this is going to be a harder place to live. And look at San Francisco. There are people in San Francisco just leaving. Pretty soon, employers, why don't we have Baptist Health? Why don't we have the large employers getting into, this is one of the things that we propose, getting into the development business and started producing housing or producing assistance to their employees until they come. Look at the restaurants. Restaurants are closing because they have no employees. The time when Baptist health system doesn't have people to staff in their hospital because those people cannot really find a place to live, then Baptist Health is going to get into the housing business. Well, unfortunately, we're not there yet. Sometimes we're a Pearl Harbor kind of mentality in our nation. Until the crisis really becomes terrible, we don't come to the fore. But once we rise to the challenge, we'll find a way to do it. American creativity and effort will make it, but we're not there yet, unfortunately. Things have to get worse before you see some of these solutions coming to the fore, I'm afraid.
So I want to thank Professor Prado, who's my dad, in case you guys haven't figured that out yet. This is my daddy. I wanted to thank Professor Prado for coming and talking to us today. I think you stimulated a really engaging conversation. Those of you who are interested in more information, you can contact our office. I actually have some of the documents that Dad was talking about, which he printed for you. And so I can get you some of those contacts. There's a second article from the New York Times that he looked at. If you're interested in information about the organization that he's working in and you wanted to connect with them, this information is here on the screen. It's cegsoflo.org. There's a community youth garden that they work with, and they are doing some work with his students that you want to do some build. Yeah, I can't share it with people yet, but I'll scan it. It's okay. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm sorry we ran a little bit late. I believe our lunches are here. Make sure you bring your ticket and claim your lunch. Thank you for everyone for participating today.
And thanks to all of you for being here.